The following half-hour show is a paid political program and is not endorsed by this station, management, or staff.
The following program is sponsored by Excalibur Insurance Management Services.
This week's guest on the Volpe Report is President Judge of Montgomery County Court of Common Pleas, Carolyn Carluccio, the first ever female president judge in Montgomery County history. She joins us today as the Republican nominee for the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, having won her first ever statewide race in the May primary for the office. Her background is impressive. She earned her Bachelor of Arts degree from Dickinson College and her Juris Doctorate from Delaware Law School. Upon becoming a lawyer, she began her legal career as a United States Attorney Prosecutor in charge of criminal prosecutions of large-scale drug dealers, bank robbers, and money launderers. Her work in the courtroom earned her recognition and praise from the United States Secret Service, the DEA, as well as the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. After her federal service, Judge Carluccio became the first ever female chief public defender in Montgomery County, where she managed a team of 35 staff and attorneys. As you can see, she has accomplished a lot of firsts in her career thus far. She has the unique experience in her public service of seeing both sides of the criminal justice system as both prosecutor and defense attorney, which is extremely rare. In 2009, she was elected to the Court of Common Pleas of Montgomery County, where she handled criminal, civil, and family law cases. After her election to president of the Court of Common Pleas, she was also honored to serve as president of the 2,000-member Montgomery County Bar Association. In addition to being the endorsed Republican candidate and then nominated candidate by her election win for Supreme Court, Judge Carluccio received the Pennsylvania Bar Association's highest designation as, quote, highly recommended. That is the highest acknowledgement the Bar Association gives. Judge Carluccio was born and raised in Montgomery County and currently lives in Bluebell with her husband Tom, and together they have 3 adult children. You will vote for this important office in this November's general election. I think you will find she is engaging and charismatic, which is fairly rare in judicial candidacies.
This is the Volpe Report, a weekly news and political interview show examining the latest local, state, and national issues with Chuck Volpe. Insightful, informative, controversial, the area's premier political talk show, the Volpe Report.
Judge, welcome to the Volpe Report.
It's a pleasure to be here, Chuck. Thanks for having me.
You sit here now as the anointed and elected Republican nominee for Pennsylvania Supreme Court. As you are probably aware, Judge, the Supreme Court, I'm a lawyer, I clerked for the Superior Court myself back in the day, fully understand, respect, and appreciate the role of the Supreme Court, not only interpreting the laws and Constitution, but also your side job of policing the profession, which is an important job. All of those things. But as you know, and I know, when you talk about Supreme Court to the average voter, now I'm talking about intelligent, civic-minded people. They have no idea what the Supreme Court power is. They read a lot about the United States Supreme Court recently because of some of the issues that affect their lives, but they really don't know what the Pennsylvania Supreme Court means and what it does and what its authority is. So talk, one, about that, what the position of Justice of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court is, and why you, as a president judge, want to be a Supreme Court justice. Loaded question out of the gate.
So there's a lot there, but to unpack. So let's start with what the Supreme Court really does. The Supreme Court, as all of you I'm sure know, is the highest court in our Commonwealth, and it's actually the oldest appellate court in the nation, which is such a great fact. If you're going to run, I feel as if I'm running for the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, our highest court, I need to have the utmost ethical values. I need to uphold my canons, my judicial canons, which guide me and which tell me what I'm allowed to do and what I'm not allowed to do as a judge. And I can't be bending those rules if I'm going to run for that highest court. And part of those rules are we have to understand there are three branches of government. And it's very clear in our Constitution that the judiciary is the branch that applies the laws, interprets the laws, and upholds our Constitution. The judiciary is not the branch that writes laws or changes laws. If there's a law that we don't like, and it applies to me too, it doesn't come before the court. That's not our job. We must go to the legislature for them to change the laws. And that's pretty clear because the legislature and the governor are the branches of government that are closest to the people. And it's the people that make these decisions. And as a judge, that I've been a judge for 14 years, and I've applied this now, and I will continue to apply it if I'm fortunate enough to get on the Supreme Court. And that rule is that I will not be changing laws. I will not be an activist judge.
Well, that is refreshing, Judge, but go ahead. You were
and I was going to talk about how, as president judge right now, I sit as president judge of the third largest and busiest court in our Commonwealth. And the job of a president judge is very similar to part of the job of a Supreme Court justice. In our Supreme Court, we hear they hear approximately 150 cases a year is really all they take. And the rest of the time, they have supervisory and administrative authority over all the courts in the Commonwealth. And as president judge, I do the exact same thing for my community and my county. In my county, I have 24 judges. I have 30 magisterial district judges. I'm also in charge of the juvenile probation, adult probation, the treatment courts, the domestic relations office. That's all the same functions of the Supreme Court. So I am already doing it, albeit on a smaller level, but I'm doing it in my county. And I think I've demonstrated that I certainly have the leadership administrative skills. My career has been full of those kind of opportunities. And I like to say that I've really met them and exceeded those expectations.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I've had the pleasure of getting to know more about you and your judicial career and professional career on the campaign. You check every box at the highest level, Judge. Now, let me talk about something you talked about, but I want to get even more in depth on. And first of all, I would like to say for the record that I've been very critical as a former Democrat of 45 years, this socialist, far-left progressivism that has taken control of the party I used to be very proud of. And now as I've said, as Ronald Reagan famously quipped, I didn't leave it, it left me. But the way it's happening, Judge, is through, first, I'll talk before I turn it back to you. Let's talk about executive overreach. Our U.S. Supreme Court is faced, I think they have already canceled out or gotten rid of, terminated more executive orders by this president, Joe Biden, maybe as any president in history, because of executive overreach. You know, a couple examples. The OSHA example, when the Democratic president tried to effectively mandate to private employers that they had to have vaccinated employees. Well, of course, the Supreme Court didn't. That was gone in a heartbeat. So I'd kind of like to know what your philosophy is and the important part about the three branches of government that our great founders intended to be in competition effectively. And, you know, that natural rivalry was supposed to keep everything. That's what checks and balances really mean to me. So take it from there. It's a big question.
So I'm going to make it really simple. I am a judge. You know what I'm going to do because I will be following the law. I'm not going to take a whim that I don't feel as if a law is appropriate or if I think it should be a little different today. I'm not going to change it because I understand my role. I am not driven by ideology. I am driven by the law. And I think that some of our judiciary has forgotten that or believes that that's not the accurate way to be a judge. There's an old saying that judges, we don't wear red robes, we don't wear blue robes, we wear black robes. And I think that's important because the minute we take the bench, politics and personal opinions need to take a back seat. They don't belong on the bench, and nothing about that should enter into our decisions. I'll tell you, Chuck, when I first was running, they did ask me, do I have opinions that were politically going to hurt me? And my answer was, I frankly have no idea, because I've never made a decision based on politics, whim, or my personal opinion. It's not the way I operate, and I don't plan to start doing that now.
Well, I think oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
One more thing I just like to, is I really do believe that respect for the judiciary has certainly been at a low, and that's sad to me. And I think that if we're going to elect somebody to our highest court, it has to be a person of the highest ethical and moral value. And if you have that person there, you're going to help to bring back a little bit of respect for our court. I find that judges in particular have a role in this. I think that we need to be educating the public on what our role is and what the limits to our role is. And once the public understands that, I think respect automatically comes back to that position.
Well, that raises an interesting point. Do you think it's the role of a justice of the Supreme Court to educate to a degree of what the role of the court is? In your opinions, I know it's dictated an opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think yes, if you can do it in your opinion without getting off the point. But I think that our role needs to be in the community. Certain as a trial level judge, I think it's really important for us to be out in the Lions clubs, in the the Kiwanis clubs, in the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts, and trying to make sure. And I teach civics education to sixth graders. I've been doing it for years and years, and I think it's important we start not only in the level of school, but that we teach it. We continue to teach it through these groups that get together, and I think that that's doing a service to the public. Once we get on the bench, it doesn't mean we're out of the public eye, because we're not allowed to be political, but we certainly can be in the community helping to educate.
You know, again, your political philosophy, I think, is going to be very relevant. Again, and you've said it, but I like you to kind of specifically dealing with what you see. I have to also point out, Judge, that, it seems like when we've had Republican majorities, the way the maps are drawn produce Republican congressional advantages. Well, we've had a Democratic Supreme Court. They swept 3 seats in 2015, and ever since then, the scales have gone completely blue and left. Now we've had a very strong Democratic majority delegation. Many Republicans feel that the Supreme Court should not be drawing lines on a map. But your thoughts on that whole area, because it talks about what you're talking about in a way anyway.
So if I am on the Supreme Court, that issue will probably come back in front of me. And so I'm very careful about where I go with that. What I will tell you is that I think in these politically divisive times, it's even more important that our courts remain above the fray and do not get involved politically, are not activists. There needs to be that separate branch that is, again, the checks and balances. And if we're able to follow the law, then we're not going to be getting involved in the political fray. And I think it's so important that we don't do that. Again, getting back to the respect for the position, getting back to how to keep the public in a place where they know they can rely on the judges, they can trust that they're going to be unbiased, they're going to be fair, and they're going to uphold our laws. And that's all we can ask of our courts.
Thanks so much, Judge. We are going to take our break. Believe it or not, it's been 3 long months since my last view. And now that my show is back on the air every Sunday at 10:30 a.m., so too will my views commence. I have well established my intellectual disdain for progressives, those miscreants at the far left polar end of responsible and intellectually sound liberalism. Unfortunately, they have hijacked the Democratic Party, a classic case of the tail wagging the dog. Thankfully, history shows that this viral infection of the Democratic Party will pass, as the equally loathsome far-right Neanderthals were once upon a time unleashed by Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy in the 1950s, and were thankfully ushered to the dustbin of history. I turn once again to New York Times editorial writer Pamela Paul, a responsible intellectual of left liberal orthodoxy. She recently penned an editorial entitled, quote, "Do Elites Really Know What's Best for Us?" In her column, she references a new book by Frederick DeBoer, a left Marxist activist, no less. Paul comments on his new book, quote, "How Elites Ate the Social Justice Movement." I will now quote liberally, no pun intended, from her column. Begin quote, "Elitism is a frequent target of criticism, especially in politics. Historically, Americans haven't liked elitists. They don't appreciate the hoity-toity, who look down on everyone else. That disdain emanates most vocally from the populist right. These self-described, down-to-earth folks without airs or fancy talk. But the left also has a beef with elitism. To those concerned with social inequity, the elites symbolize a flawed meritocracy in their view. Certain demographic groups get elevated over others and bar access to those historically deprived of power, especially political and economic power. A more sophisticated and productive critique of elites comes from Frederick de Boer in his new book, and the failings of the left seem to break his heart the most. In this, he and I are fully aligned. Begin his quote, "It's okay to call nonsense nonsense, even if you feel it's on your own side." He writes, quote, "You can defend your values while still admitting when feckless people take liberal ideology to bizarre ends," end quote. To that end, de Boer scrutinizes the self-interest of the nonprofit industry, the elite capture of the Black Lives Matter movement, and other failures and shortcomings among progressive movers. One of the bravest chapters in his new book examines the elitism of the defund the police movement, which he argues hurts the cause of social justice. Research shows more policing has reduced homicides, which disproportionately affect Black Americans. Black Americans are about 13% of the population, but make up more than half of homicide victims. What's easy for radical activists and academics to write on a placard turns out to be hard for many Black Americans to actually live with. Taking the police off the streets may minimize the possibility of police violence against Black people, but it will do little to mitigate the greater problem of all other violence against Black people. As de Boer notes, quote, "Significant majorities of Black Americans were twice as likely as white Democrats to say reducing crime should be a top priority. Many white progressives are so terrified of being labeled racist themselves that they prioritize self-protection over helping out the very people they profess to want to help, people they may not understand well at all," end quote. I have been saying this for 2 years now, all the way back to the voter ID law in Georgia, which elicited a banshee howl from the Democratic President Joe Biden and other hypocritical Democrats as Jim Crow 2.0. I pointed out then that the mere suggestion that Black Americans were incapable of completing a simple voter ID form, which was less complicated than the IDs that all peoples had to complete for a driver's license, to open a checking account, to purchase alcohol, to check into a hotel room, or to get on an airplane, was the most pejorative, racist, and condescending profile of Black Americans ever. Thankfully, Black leaders in the United States Congress called a press conference and released an editorial statement condemning Biden and the Democrats for their hypocrisy. Now, back to Pamela Paul's editorial. All I have to say and comment is, amen. First question back from break, Judge, is you've traveled the state now extensively for at least a year, and you're talking to voters. I have had the chance to interject with voters as a candidate for governor, as a candidate for senator, but I get asked different questions. There are different issues that people ask, you know, a governor candidate or a Senate candidate or a congressional candidate or the like. But obviously people understand that you run for justice of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. What kind of interaction? I'm curious myself. I got to believe some of our viewers would be, you know, what do you tell people and what do they want to know about what you're going to do as a justice of the Supreme Court? Like, what kind of subjects do you cover?
So I can tell you I have been in all 67 counties.
Wow.
Most of them 2, 3, 4 times. So I have been out there talking to the people. I don't care if they're Republicans, Democrats, or independents. There's a lot of common themes I'm hearing. They want judges who are fair, unbiased, and follow the law. They're also seeking balance. And I think that my candidacy in particular can bring a lot of balance to our court. Right now, we've got 5 seats that are considered Democratic seats and 2 that are considered Republican. And I think whether you're Republican, Democrat, or independent, you can agree that's not balance. And that also kind of ties into Lady Justice and her scales that she carries. Scales are for balance. They're for justice. You need to weigh it. And 5'2", it doesn't look too good on those scales. I also think that I bring the balance from having been a federal prosecutor and a chief public defender. That's balance in the fact that I understand how to protect our communities while honoring those constitutional rights that are afforded all people accused of crimes. And that's balance again. And finally, another balance that I can bring is we look at our Supreme Court, and right now there are 6 justices up there, and 4 of those justices come from large urban areas. It's either Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, and then 2 are from very rural areas. There is no justice from any of our suburban areas, which is what I would represent. And finally, I've got a lot of things I'm going to spit out here.
Yeah.
Another thing that if I am elected to this position, it will be the first time in Pennsylvania history that there have been a majority of women on our Pennsylvania Supreme Court.
Wow.
Which is interesting.
Yeah, I think as we talked off camera, worth noting, has there ever been, I think there may have been one Italian, but there haven't been many.
There have been a couple, but I will say it's been nearly 20 years since there's been an Italian American. That's correct. So I'd like to fill that void too.
Yeah, you check a lot of boxes.
I'm very proud of my Italian heritage.
You should be. Let's talk about, again, one of my difficulties, there's so many questions I want to ask you about, but I know you're not allowed to comment on, about things that could come before you, matters you cannot tip your hand on. Let me just get a flavor for it, and I know voters will care about this. We seem to be living in a time, Judge, of law and disorder. We have seen progressive district attorneys, not just in Pennsylvania, but all across the country, basically putting forth policies. I've got to tell you, back when I went to law school, if anybody told me that 40 years in the future, we would be seeing, for example, Oregon basically saying all Class 1 narcotics are good. They're no longer illegal. We see progressive district attorneys flat out not prosecuting crimes, and it's led to, I believe, catastrophes in many of our major cities, not only in Pennsylvania but around the country. So obviously, crime is directly tied, and enforcement thereof is something the Supreme Court will obviously pass on. But I'd like to get your philosophy on the issue of law and order, because right now every poll, Judge, and it will affect your race, people care about it, and they feel like the criminals, the inmates are running the asylum. So go ahead.
So I have the experience to handle that. I was a federal prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office for 9 years. And that brought me experience that's just been unmatched in terms of how you handle cases, how you understand them. I work mainly with drug dealers, but I also handle bank robbery, white collar fraud, healthcare fraud. We touched on a little bit of everything. And that brought me the experience that I need to really understand what needs to be done. Now, as a Supreme Court justice, obviously, we're not going to be involved in the actual prosecutions. We're not going to be at that trial level. We're going to be looking at the cases from an appellate perspective of whether or not the law was followed and the Constitution was upheld. And that's how simple it is. And again, I think that I will be a justice that you can count on. You will know what I'm doing because I will be following the law. You don't have to worry that I'm going to take a whim and go off on it because I don't like the way the law is. It's not my role. I will not be doing that.
Well, one of the things, for I think the voters and viewers benefit, when you say, Judge, follow the law, I know exactly what you mean, but let me kind of get into that, probe that a little bit. Following the law, again, depending on the political philosophy you talk to, some believe, or what we call, I guess, textualists, that they look at what the words are in the United States Constitution and in the Pennsylvania Constitution or in a statute that's before you. Then there is a judicial philosophy, which is tied to a political philosophy, that thinks you can kind of interpret and that these things were malleable, that those words were written centuries ago and are intended to be progressively modified now in ways that are more, let's say, compatible with our current times. So that has raised tremendous furor in legal circles, in legal journals, in law review articles about what the role, and that's part of your role that you're running for. Do we follow the Constitution in the intent of the founding principles of this country, or are we free to, as centuries go by, effectively, well, we think this is what they meant and they would have wanted us to do this? Where do you fall in that?
So as a judge, that is simply not our job. If the legislature wants to make a change to keep up with the times, that's their role, that's their prerogative. We are there simply to make sure that if they make a change, if they amend our Constitution, that it's still constitutional. That's our job, not to make that change. And that is a problem that has occurred, people thinking that it's a judge's job for social activism or social change. It is not the place to effectuate that.
I read an opinion, I won't name names on television, but I read an opinion several months ago, a little longer than that, about a U.S. Supreme Court justice was quoting a justice from a century ago. And a reference was made which was acceptable at that time. In fact, it was in the statute at that time. So the justice was referring and quoting a statute to illegal alien was the term, and the justice in particular changed that. In quoting the quote, I didn't think, as I said, when I went to law school, you weren't allowed to change quotes to make them politically correct for 100 years later. Well, that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. Well, I agree it probably could have come up with a better term than illegal alien, but that's what it says, and you can refer to it however you'd like, but if you're going to quote the justice, especially if those were the words in the statute, Judge. So I had to throw that comment. That's kind of what I was also referring to. But as we run down on time,
I don't know.
But as we run down on time, Judge, I'd like to leave you with this. You have a stump speech, and we don't have time for that. But the reasons that were in your gut, as you say in politics, the fire in the belly, that made you want to seek this high office, and why you think you're the one to get the job done and should be the choice of the voters in Pennsylvania.
I think I can really narrow that down to three real reasons, and we've talked about them. And the first one is to bring balance to the court. And we've talked about the fact that the 5-2 is just not balance. I have balance in not only in my political background, but in everything else, in what my experience and who I am and where I come from. That's all balance. I'm also running because I think common sense belongs in our court. And finally, I'm running because politics does not belong there. I think we can agree no court in our Commonwealth should have political bent to it. We just shouldn't, and we should not bring our politics to the bench. So I'm running to be a fair, impartial judge. I've done it for 14 years, and I think my record certainly speaks for itself. I'm of the highest moral and ethical value, and I think that's certainly important for the highest court in our Commonwealth.
That's a very eloquent disposition of why you should be a justice of the Supreme Court. So you've made your case to the voters of Pennsylvania. I wish you the best of luck in your endeavors, Judge.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Judge.
Now there's more places you can see the Volpe Report. Watch every Sunday morning at 10:30 a.m. on Fox 56. Listen on WILK Radio Sundays at 11:30 a.m. or watch on YouTube at The Volpe Report. More ways to watch. Still the same premier public affairs show dedicated to the topics that matter most to Pennsylvanians.